This is Mommyhood Unscripted, a show about moms for moms.
Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us on Mommyhood Unscripted. I'm Nicole Nalepa. You know, when a couple wants to start a family, it can be anything but easy, right? There's a whole process that comes along with it. And there are also some unexpected struggles too with infertility. Even pushing off basically the timeline of having kids can bring a lot of heartbreak. Adoption can be a great pathway though to parenthood and something not everyone considers. But it can also come with some mental hurdles as you prepare for the process. Adoption expert Nicole Witt serves as the executive director of the Adoption Consultancy. She's also the host of Adopting, the podcast, which is geared towards people who are just starting to think about adopting or ready to get started. And Nicole is joining us now on Mommyhood Unscripted with some advice when it comes to adoption, the process, some practical tips, and deciding whether it's the right next step for you. So without further ado, thanks, Nicole, for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So this is a very important topic, I think, for so many parents to explore, even if it's something they're not really interested in, because it's that option there, I think, when you don't realize you may need it or want it, right?
Right. Yeah, a lot of people who come to adoption find themselves a little bit surprised to be there, and they weren't really expecting it, or it wasn't one of the factors that they had considered when they were like, well, if plan A isn't working for how we're going to build our family, what's plan B or C? But sometimes adoption doesn't come up until they've sort of run out of all those other plans. It's something I think they should be in the mix a little bit earlier. Maybe they decide it's not right for them at that point, but at least they've started thinking about it a little bit. So maybe it's not as much of a surprise if and when they get there.
Now, this is something that hundreds of thousands of Americans do. But I think that there are some misconceptions out there surrounding adoption that sometimes prevent people from even considering it or starting the journey. So I wanted to talk to you about some of those misconceptions.
Yeah, there are a lot of myths about adoption. Some of the big ones are that it takes years to adopt a healthy baby. That doesn't have to be true if you're really proactive about the process. There are myths about that all of the babies are severely drug exposed, and there certainly are babies out there that have those challenges, but that's not all of the babies that are being placed for adoption. One of the big ones is worrying about the legalities of it, and can the birth parents come back and show up on your doorstep and just take the child back years down the road. That's also something that cannot happen, if the adoption has been legally done through reputable sources. So there are a lot of those myths that keep people from ever considering it or pursuing it that just aren't true.
And it's important to know that, there are so many different cases and scenarios. And I think that that's, what this episode is all about today, kind of exposing, the truths of adoption, when it would be a good fit for couples and, the resources that are out there to kind of dive deeper into it. So as we're diving deeper into this topic, first and foremost, how do you know if adoption would be the right path for you? Or what are some of the flags that might be, going off where this is definitely something we should start exploring?
Yeah, I think so. Most of the clients that I work with, most people who pursue adoption, and not all, but most people get there after a long journey through infertility, right? So I think for those people, the question becomes if those other methods, those medical methods and so on, just aren't working for them. It's, do they want to be a parent, or do they want to only be a biological parent? If they can't be a biological parent, would they not be a parent at all? Right? If they decide that they want to be a parent more than say they want to be pregnant, then adoption can absolutely be the right path for them.
And I have to imagine that there's a huge emotional, like an overwhelming emotional thing that's stuck to that decision, right? So how do you make that mental shift?
Yeah, and that's a really important piece of it. And usually they're well served to come to that decision through the help of a counselor or a therapist in the process, because I find that people who come to adoption with the mindset of, we have to do this because nothing else is working and this probably won't work either.
Yeah.
They of course have a very hard time with adoption and it is less likely to work for them. But people who come to the mindset saying, okay, this wasn't how we originally envisioned maybe building our family, but we understand, that chapter is now closed. This is the beginning of a new and exciting chapter that we just weren't expecting, but it doesn't mean it's second best. And it works. And, this is the first step down that path. Those are the people who have a lot more success with it and a much more positive experience and positive outcome. But it's not easy to get to that place and it does take time. And like I mentioned, it usually, you can really benefit by working through that with a counselor or a therapist to help you decide if this really is the right path for you, because it does come with a lot of challenges. It's not the same as parenting a biological child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done a lot of infertility stories over the years, and a lot of the common themes throughout, of course, it's, not a one size fits all situation, but that there's a lot of mental blocks attached to infertility. So when a couple is opening themselves up to the path of adoption, sometimes there are situations where, the mom becomes pregnant actually with a biological child as well, which is really interesting, right? Like opening up your heart and your mind to welcome another child into your life and then clearing something up here going on that may be attached to something down here, right?
Yeah, I mean, it does, technically speaking or statistically speaking, those pregnancy rates are actually no higher than, people who are not pursuing adoption. But anecdotally, you certainly hear those stories. And usually when that does, it depends on where people are in the process. But a lot of times, they would want to continue with both paths. But there's also the birth moms involved, right? And they, at least for private adoption of newborns, they're the ones selecting the families. And maybe they've selected that family because they didn't have any other children and they want their child to have undivided attention for a certain amount of time. Or if they're going to share attention, maybe they don't want the child sharing attention with biological child who was born, within just a few months. So sometimes that birth mom would change her mind and say, I'm not that comfortable placing with that family anymore. I'd rather place with a different family. So it's not quite that simple. If that happens, there are other people, as part of the process who have to decide if they're comfortable with that too.
And I guess we should get right into the different, types of adoptions that there are out there, because there are a lot of avenues that you can go to adopt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's foster adoption, which is, everybody knows what that is, but it's usually adopting slightly older children. And those are the children who are truly in need, who really do need a family and stability. If you're talking about private adoption of newborns, there are, many, many people looking to adopt for each baby that's placed for adoption. So that's not so much, the children who are truly in need or might not have a family if one family doesn't adopt them, right? There are lots of families looking to adopt them. There are different ways to go about private adoption of a newborn. You can go through an agency, you can go through an attorney, you can do it independently. You can work with multiple agencies, which is the approach that we have our clients take, so that they have a lot more opportunities, so things can tend to go faster. But there are lots of different ways to do it depending on your budget, your sort of capacity to handle, a lot of different things from a time perspective and an emotional perspective. But there are different ways to pursue private domestic adoption. And then there's international adoption as well. That's not as robust as it used to be. A lot of countries have closed down or really limited the children who are placed for adoption internationally, but it's still an option, and for some people, it's absolutely the right fit.
Was that more of a common option back in the day, the international adoption?
Yes, it really was. There's much less of it today than there used to be. Even pre-COVID, it was slowing down. There were a lot of countries that were closing for concerns of fraud, for political reasons, et cetera. And then with COVID, when you had all of the country closures and the travel bans and so on, it basically came to a halt. And when the country started opening back up, it didn't completely go back to where it was before. And then, China relaxed their one child policy. So that made a big difference. So you have all these different moving parts to it that really have slowed down international adoption.
So what is the most common route that people take for adoption these days?
Well, so I only work with private domestic adoption. So those are sort of the numbers that I know. I think probably foster adoption or kinship adoption, with family members is a bit higher because private adoption has slowed down a bit. But private domestic adoption is certainly much larger than, say, international adoption.
And private domestic adoption, I don't know too much information. What is that process like? How is the birth mother attached to that? Are they sought out? Do they sign up with an agency? How do you know which agency to go with?
Right. That encompasses, there are a lot of different ways to do it, but it encompasses all the different ways, whether it's going through one agency or several agencies, an attorney doing outreach on your own to find a potential birth mom. But those are all different ways of doing private domestic adoption. The, I guess, common denominators, if you will, is that that expectant mom does see what we call the profiles of the families out there who are hoping to adopt, and she's the one who selects the family that she wants to place her child with. And then usually that match happens somewhere during the course of the pregnancy. So, it could happen earlier, it could happen later, but there's usually some time during the course of the pregnancy where the expectant mom and the hopeful adoptive parents are building a relationship. Whether that's through phone calls or texts or visits, it all depends on everybody's comfort level, but they're usually building a relationship throughout the course of the pregnancy that continues to some extent after the baby is born as well. Sometimes that looks like just sending updates and pictures through a third party. And sometimes it looks like, maintaining a very personal relationship if people have really bonded to each other.
Wow. And I feel like, in the TV shows and movies, what you see is even like surrogates too, or those adoption, relationships as well, non-surrogates, both parties having that relationship of, kinship throughout, which is really nice. But also in the movies and the TV shows, I know everything you see on TV is not necessarily real, but ... this is a topic we don't know about as much. You also see sometimes like the drama surrounding a birth mom pulling out. What is the probability of that happening? And is that birth parent legally tied to continuing with the process, or do they have the option to pull out as well?
Yeah, so it all depends on the state involved. So every state has its own laws, but sort of to generalize, or the most common situation is that the birth mom can never sign the consents prior to the birth. Usually it's somewhere around 48 hours after the birth where she's signing the consents. So up until that point, she can, of course, always change her mind and choose to parent her child. Then when she signs the consents, again, every state is different. Sometimes those are immediately irrevocable, so it's kind of just a done deal at that point. In other states, she has a certain window of time where she could change her mind, whether that be 3 days, 3 months, et cetera. So every state is a little bit different. But then once that time period passes, then that would be a done deal. So up until that point where consents are signed and are irrevocable, she has the option to choose to parent. It doesn't happen as often as people think, or as often as they fear, as the adoptive parents fear from, seeing that on the TV shows and the movies. But it certainly does happen, and it is a real risk to the adoptive parents who are going through the adoption and investing the time and the money and the emotion. Some of the numbers you hear kicked around, and there are no hard and fast statistics on it, but that it happens about 30% of the time. That feels a little bit high to me, with the places that I work with. I feel like maybe it's a bit closer to 20%. But again, it certainly does happen, and she has every right to make that decision up until the point where legally she can't anymore.
And you talked about, different states having different sets of laws. So what if, here I am in Connecticut and I want to adopt a child in California or North Dakota? What series of laws do you follow? Would it be the birth mother's state?
Yeah, so it's going to, and I say usually because with adoption, there are always exceptions to every rule, but almost always it's going to be the law of the state where the baby is being born.
Okay.
So it's usually the birth mom's home state. There are some instances where she can sign up with an agency in another state and actually travel to that state to give birth.
Oh.
There are some instances where she might go to the home state of the adoptive parents and give birth there, but it's where the baby's being born, and again, it's almost always her home state.
And in some situations, depending, I'm imagining, on the relationship between the birth mother and, the adoptive parents, sometimes like they're there for the birth, right?
Yeah, a lot of times they're maybe not in the delivery room per se, although sometimes they are, but they are almost always at the hospital or nearby. At the time of the birth. Again, that's all totally up to the birth mom. Until she signs those consents, she is making all of the decisions, right? She has all the legal rights. So she can decide what visitors she wants in the hospital, who she wants in the delivery room, of course, who she wants visiting her in her hospital room after the delivery. So it's totally up to her. But again, most times they have developed some sort of relationship during the course of the pregnancy. So the adoptive parents are usually there. Again, if not in the delivery room, visiting with her afterwards, visiting with the baby afterwards. Sometimes they're even able to get their own room at the hospital. And if the birth mom consents, they can have the baby in the room with them for either part or all of the time.
Wow. Yeah, I've seen and heard of some instances where, the adoptive parents are there right after the birth, and like they immediately, they begin and take part in the skin-on-skin contact when the baby's just born, which is so sweet. And certainly such a gift to have that experience as the adoptive parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good for the baby too.
Right, absolutely, to make those connections so early on in life.
Yeah.
So financially, what is this process like? Is it an expensive one? Are there resources out there to help alleviate some of the costs?
Yes and yes. It is. Unfortunately, it's a very expensive process. Again, talking about private adoption of a newborn. Mm-hmm. Foster care is different. Foster care is free or virtually free. It comes with actually some financial benefits for the child. But private adoption of a newborn, it is usually pretty expensive these days. There are a lot of legal fees, agency fees, overhead costs, supporting the birth mom with her pregnancy related expenses, making sure the child's being, has a healthy in utero environment, et cetera. So all of those things cost money. So it can be, in the 50,000s, not always. There are some places out there that are lower cost. Sometimes they do sliding scale based on income, but often it can be that expensive. There are definitely resources to help with that. There is a tax credit, and for people who qualify, it's a dollar for dollar credit. So it's much more valuable than an adoption. So it can ultimately put about $17,000 back in their pocket. So that is obviously a huge help. There are employers who offer adoption reimbursement. Sometimes it can be $2,000. Sometimes it can be $30,000.
Wow.
So that obviously makes a huge difference as well. And there are loans and grants out there too for people who need them.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so nice to know that there are resources out there to help with the process. And I mean, you really need to do a lot of your homework and research too as you're, prepping to see if this is the next step for you and your family.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you really want to go into adoption as informed as possible. And there are kind of two pieces to it, right? You want to be informed about the adoption process itself. And you also want to be informed about adoptive parenting and how that is different, from raising a biological child. I really focus on the process piece of it, and I guide people kind of step by step through that to take those unknowns and stress out of that for them. And there are plenty of resources out there who focus on the parenting side of it. But really, both of those should be researched pretty thoroughly before jumping in.
And I've heard the word home study thrown around, that term. What exactly is that?
So the home study, it's one of those things that's gotten like a really bad reputation as being this incredibly difficult process, and it's not. Basically, it's the legal process that makes sure that you can provide a safe and loving home for a child. And it results in the home study report, which basically gives you legal permission to go ahead and adopt. So the headache of it is that it's a huge paper chase, right? You have to fill in all kinds of forms. You have to show, the proof of your financial situation, proof of employment, get letters of reference, get approval from medical professionals that you're healthy and have a normal, lifespan. And then you have a social worker come to your home and actually do a visit. And, they're not breaking out the white glove and looking for dust or, that kind of thing. They're just making sure that you can provide a safe and loving environment for a child. So, it's not a big deal. Some people actually enjoy the process. They have a great conversation with the social worker. They learn a lot, about what to expect from the process and from the parenting. And they feel that it helps them to be better prepared. But it's, it's a ton of paperwork and it's good, right? It's making sure that these children are going to safe homes.
And is this home study implemented in every single adoption case, including DCF?
Yes. So the home studies are a little bit different depending. The DCF home studies are actually a bit more intensive and more detailed. There are some exceptions if you're doing a kinship adoption where you might not need a home study, but almost every adoption is going to require a home study.
Gotcha. So the next question I have for you is about once you make that match, whether the child's a little older, whether the child is a newborn, what are the signs to look for when you know it's the right match? And what happens if it's not a good match? Are there any red flags that we should be, on the lookout for?
Yeah, well, so from my perspective, again, focusing on newborns, that's going to be very different than, say through DCF when you're actually matching with a child, right? That's a whole different area that I just don't work in. Yeah. But in my case, so the adoptive parents are matching with the potential birth mom. So that's where the relationship is. Now, like I had mentioned, she chooses them from what we call their profile, and it's up to her how much she wants to dig into that first. Sometimes she just chooses based on the profile itself. Sometimes she has a conversation with them, maybe with some other families, maybe multiple conversations, before she makes her decision. So she can take as much time as she wants, get whatever information is important to her before she decides and chooses the family. So by the time she does that, she usually has a pretty good idea of kind of who they are and what the child's life would be like with them. So, in most situations, there aren't really any surprises that come up with that create any problems from that side of the thing, of the process. And then from the other side, once she selects the adoptive parents, that's when they have more of an opportunity to kind of get to know more about her. But prior to that, they have communicated with the agency sort of what their parameters are, what scenarios they're open to, what they're not. So they're only in consideration to begin with if this is a likely positive match that meets everybody's requirements and preferences. So fortunately, I've had extremely few instances where that hasn't worked out. I mean, I've been doing this work for about 20 years now, and I think I've had 2 cases where the match hasn't worked out just because people, once they got to know each other better, felt like it wasn't the right connection. So fortunately, there's enough research and due diligence that goes into it up front that the matches tend to be quite good.
That's great to hear. And another question, as the child is getting older and that decision is made whether or not to tell them, that they were adopted and go down that rabbit hole, if you will, are there parents that are coming to you guys and saying, where are the resources for that if and when that happens? Like, I can imagine that's a huge concern, for parents, especially when you're just starting the process of adopting and you can't, see 5 years, 6 years down the road, or that famous family tree thing, project.
Right, the school project, right. Yeah, so that is a question that a lot of people have when they're brand new to the process. As soon as people really start learning about adoption, one of the things people learn, I think, pretty early on is that really best practices from all the research, all the professionals out there, is that this should never be like a conversation that you have with the child out of the blue where it's something they didn't know before. Instead, it should be something that you are talking to them about from day one, that you bring them home long before they can understand what you're actually saying. So as they grow up, it's just a natural part of their story. It's no big secret that was kept from them. It's just a natural part of their story. And as they grow up, you can add in more age appropriate details and that sort of thing. And there are lots of age appropriate books for different levels that help to introduce the topic. And, there are certainly counselors and therapists that can help if there are adoptive parents who are struggling with, maybe there's some difficult aspects to the child's story, and how and when do you share those, right? That can really help to get a professional involved for some of those things. But generally speaking, it should just always be part of the family conversation.
All right. So the recommendation you're saying is, that's their story, and you don't have to put a stigma or anything or have this deep, dark family secret.
Right. Exactly. And, it depends on what level of openness they have with the birth mom, right? They may just grow up knowing, this is my birth mom and this is my adopted mom, or, sometimes they have different names, for different people in the process. But if she's involved, if they do have a more open type of relationship, again, they're just going to know from the beginning, and that's going to be their normal situation, right? It's not going to be anything unusual or strange to them. It's just going to be what they grew up with.
Right. And I also wanted to ask you a question. We discussed infertility, but there's also this new trend among, generations now that are coming up into parenthood, and that is delaying parenthood, either because of professional reasons, financially. A lot of people, more so than not, are waiting longer for the family planning to really kick in. So obviously with that comes high-risk pregnancy situations, depending on your age. So I kind of wanted to get your take on, in that situation, high-risk pregnancy versus adoption, and what are you seeing, and what are some of the pros and cons there?
Yeah, it really is happening more and more. The clients I have now versus the clients that I had, 20 years ago are definitely older. And I find that struggles with infertility come as a surprise to many of them. I feel like our society as a whole doesn't do a great job of communicating how much fertility really starts to significantly drop off after mid-30s, right? There are so many people who are starting their families or trying to start their families in their early 40s, and then they're surprised when they struggle. And they see, fortunately, a lot of celebrities have become more and more open about using IVF, because I think that was a reason why people just assumed they could get pregnant in their 40s without any trouble. I don't think some celebrities are as open as, say, using donor eggs. And that's their business. They certainly don't have to share that information. But I think that perpetuates still some of the myths or the thinking that people have about, having a baby in your 40s is no big deal. And it is a big deal. It's much harder than people expect. In terms of, how high risk the pregnancy is going to be, I think the issue is more of, can they get pregnant? Right. And of course, they need to talk to their medical doctor about, if they can, is that a good idea? I think a lot of women in their 40s, I'm no medical professional, but I think a lot of women in their 40s, if they can get pregnant, they can certainly have a very healthy pregnancy. But I think the challenge for more of them is becoming pregnant in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you for clarifying that for sure. And resources, we know that there's a plethora out there, but which resources would you, pinpoint when it comes to a couple who's really interested, in making this part of their story?
Yeah, one of the resources I would not recommend, at least at the very beginning, is, say, Facebook groups or groups like that, because that can just overwhelm people with so many differing perspectives all at once that it just becomes really overwhelming. So I think you want to kind of start dipping your toe in more simply than that. Maybe start talking to some agencies in your area, go to some information sessions, reach out to consultants like myself who can start to do education about it. Maybe reach out to some therapists or counselors in your area who specialize in infertility and adoption, and just kind of start having conversations. And again, I think more one-on-one personal conversations versus having, a flood of information from the internet being thrown at you about what it looks like and what some of the options are and what some of the choices are. And people will often pretty quickly start narrowing down the path that makes the most sense for them. And then from there, then you can start kind of branching out and getting more of the information surrounded about that. But you really need to find that right piece of the path for yourself first.
Mm-hmm. And where can we find you and get in touch with you, Nicole?
So the best way to find me is via my website. It's theadoptionconsultancy.com. So that's the best way.
And also your podcast too, you have, right?
Yes, so I have a podcast as well. It's Adopting the Podcast, and that the platform for that is on adopting.com.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole Witt, for all of this wittyful information when it comes to adoption. And certainly, I'm sure it's going to help some families out there as they're looking to expand. So we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe to Mommyhood Unscripted. Share it with your friends, too. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, Roku, and everywhere else you get your podcast. I'm Nicole Nalepa. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, Mama, you're doing great.